Hey gang, thank you for joining me at Two Texas Lobsters React. I am in Omaha, Nebraska, where it's about 5 degrees outside. I don't know why, because it is in April. But anyway, so I thought maybe before bedtime I would get one more video in, and this is 10 ludicrous laws from the Middle Ages that we still break today. Without any further ado, let's get right on into it.
The Middle Ages spanned from roughly 500 to 1500 CE. For much of that time, the people of England lived under a feudal system in which both the laws and the penalties for breaking them were significantly more bizarre than the ones we are familiar with today. So, today we're going to take a look at 10 ludicrous laws from the Middle Ages that we still break today. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other legal topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time to bone up for the medieval bar exam. Today's football players, or soccer players for the Americans among us, have a reputation of being dramatic over the smallest of injuries. But their predecessors were the exact opposite. Medieval football was an extremely violent game. There weren't nearly as many rules, and there was a hell of a lot more bloodshed. First off, rather than a ball, an inflated pig's bladder was kicked up and down the entire length of a village, and the goals could sometimes be miles apart. Players could kick and punch both the bladder and their opponents, and presumably their opponents' bladders. This made fouls virtually non-existent and predictably resulted in many injuries and the occasional death. Football was banned in 1349 by Edward III, but not because he was concerned about players getting hurt. It was a matter of national security. You see, in 1349, England was at war with France. Edward needed soldiers for his army, but the country was also suffering the loss of many lives due to the Black Death. That's the plague, not a rival football team. Edward wanted his remaining healthy men to be focused on their archery practice rather than getting distracted by football. And he wasn't messing around. The punishment for playing football was 6 days in prison.
Wow.
Football wasn't the only sport banned in the Middle Ages. In 1485, it became illegal for anyone but nobles to play tennis, with the only exception being on Christmas Day. Because, hey, it's Christmas. But why ban tennis? Well, medieval tennis was believed to disrupt labor and encourage gambling. The banning of tennis in the lower classes helped to maintain the feudal hierarchy. Tennis began to be seen as an exclusively upper-class sport because it needed expensive equipment and required an understanding of complex rules and social etiquette.
Those rackets.
This is one of the reasons tennis eventually became known as the sport of kings, although that title is sometimes afforded to things like horse racing and dodgeball, probably. Kings liked a lot of sports. But it is true that both Henry VII and Henry VIII were very into tennis. And Henry VIII was allegedly pretty good at it. A Venetian ambassador who watched him play in his youth said, "It was the prettiest thing in the world to see him play, his fair skin glowing through a shirt of the finest texture." Apparently old Hank was an absolute vision in a crisp white Izod polo. The English town of Newmarket is known as the birthplace of horse racing. The sport actually dates back to the 12th century, but James I popularized it after building a palace in Newmarket in 1606. Over time, horse racing in Newmarket grew into a large business, and the town was forced to establish laws to protect the horses, including one that made it illegal for people to blow their noses in the street. The idea was to reduce the risk of the horses getting sick from the public's leaky schnozzes. It's unclear how effective this strategy was, but it must have been a challenge for people who were allergic to horse dander. Blowing one's nose wasn't the only thing that could get a person in trouble. Anyone walking around with a head cold or temperature had to pay a fine.
Wow.
They tell. Maybe they set up DUI checkpoints. Driving under influenza.
Well, that's crazy.
Today, it's daunting enough to propose to someone. You're never completely sure of what their answer will be, which runs you the risk of being rejected on the Jumbotron in front of thousands of Steelers fans. However, the process was much more nerve-wracking in the Middle Ages. Societal rank played a large role in medieval life, especially for those on the bottom rung of the social ladder. Peasants and serfs working and living under landowners essentially had no freedom. A man wanting to get married not only had to ask the father of the bride's permission, but also that of their landowners. Imagine having to get your boss or landlord's okay to get hitched. No, really, imagine it. And the situation was even worse if you were a woman. If your husband died, the landowner could force you to marry another man in a relatively short amount of time.
Wow.
If you refused, you would be subject to punishment.
Oh, that's horrible.
Throughout the Middle Ages, there were a number of religious laws that tried to restrict when people could have sex. Although, if we're being honest, some people probably didn't need the law's help to stay abstinent. Have you seen medieval portraits? For instance, a married couple could only have sex on 4 days of the week. Thursday and Friday were out because people were supposed to prepare for Holy Communion. And don't even think about bumping uglies on Sunday. That is the Lord's Day. But those weren't the only days where smashing was prohibited. There were many other sexless periods throughout the year, including 47 to 62 days during Lent, the 35 days before Christmas, and the time around the Feast of Pentecost, which could be anywhere from 40 to 60 days. Women were also discouraged from making eye contact with men during these dry spells, so as to not stimulate desire in the observer and the observed. 15th century Britain was a time of flamboyance. Along with short shirts, long, pointy-ended shoes known as krakows, or pikes, had become the height of men's fashion. It was believed that the longer the toe, the more masculine and rich the wearer. It was like wearing a muscular Ferrari on your foot. Shoes sometimes extended up to 5 inches beyond the toe. This led to the ends occasionally having to be tied around the wearer's ankles. Randomly falling on your face was apparently also considered a sign of extreme masculinity. Those are clown shoes, fellas. You've just invented clown shoes. As the fashion continued growing and peasants began wearing more extravagant clothing, the crown finally decided to step in. And it wasn't because they worried that a nation full of people wearing Ronald McDonald shoes would make England look ridiculous. No, they just wanted to preserve the feudal
So, there are still shoes like this. They're boots, and you most often see them on Hispanic people, Mexican people wear boots with very long, skinny, upturned toes. And I'm sorry, it's not for me.
hierarchy and stop people from dressing above their social rank. Between 1463 and 1604, a law went into effect that said no knight under the rank of lord, esquire, or gentleman, nor any other person, shall wear any shoes or boots having spikes or points which exceed the length of 2 inches. The punishment was a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence, which is the modern equivalent of about 135 US dollars.
God, that's a lot of money.
In the Middle Ages, there were many laws that restricted what people could eat and drink, but they weren't necessarily in the interest of public health. These laws were mostly intended to prevent lower-class people from matching the binge-eating lifestyle of the nobility. Apparently, demolishing the Golden Corral buffet isn't nearly as fun unless you don't want people starve to death while you do it.
It's gross.
That being said, some of the dietary laws applied to everyone. For instance, in 1336, a law was passed which banned all people, regardless of status, from being served a meal with more than 2 courses. And just so no one got clever, the law made sure to specify that soup counted as a full-course meal and not just a sauce. The exception to the law was on certain festivals, such as Christmas, where 3 courses were allowed. Did ketchup count as a vegetable course?
Telling you what you can eat, and when, and how. Oh.
In medieval England, the peasants greatly outnumbered the nobility. So to maintain their grip on power and prevent revolts, the upper-class authorities made it so that even the smallest of crimes had harsh penalties. The idea was to keep the poor perpetually terrified of stepping even slightly out of line, and it was generally a pretty successful strategy. Even petty crimes like theft, disturbing the peace, or even vagrancy sometimes resulted in extremely harsh punishments, from flogging to the removal of body parts. For example, lopping off one or both hands was an abiding favorite. In fact, until 1215, even being accused of a crime resulted in the enduring of an ordeal to reveal your innocence or guilt. There were 3 such ordeals. The ordeal by fire had the accused hold a red-hot iron bar in their hands and walk 3 meters. After 3 days of being bandaged up, if the wound wasn't healing, they were guilty. Considering the general lack of Bactine during the Middle Ages, most people probably failed this ordeal. The second was the ordeal by water. Here the accused was bound with a knotted rope and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it meant that the water had not accepted them, and therefore they were guilty. For many, their only crime was being naturally buoyant. Finally, there was the
So you think people back then were stupid, and that's why they had these laws. They were smart, and they knew that you would die, and that's why they did it. And they could get away with it, because if you try to contest it, you'd be guilty of something else.
ordeal by combat, in which the accused had to battle their accuser. It was believed that God would grant victory to the innocent party, because the fight generally resulted in the loser's death. The Pope canceled the practice of ordeals in 1215, and it was replaced by a jury process. Hooray for progress! In the Middle Ages, people had to watch their tongues, both metaphorically and literally. This was to avoid breaking the religious laws regarding blasphemy, which is the action of speaking ill about God or other sacred things, such as church doctrine or Evel Knievel. The law was put in place by the Catholic Church to maintain control and order, 2 things they were pretty big on. Blasphemy was considered a serious crime, and it carried an equally severe punishment. Offenders would regularly be tied down while their tongue was removed with hot pliers. If you were lucky, you'd just get hanged, or maybe stoned. And not the fun kind of stoned, the bad kind, with rocks. Science was still in its infancy in medieval Europe, so much of the workings of the natural world were a big, fat mystery. Usually, the will of God was the answer to anything that could not be explained. However, when it came to unfortunate developments such as sickness, bad harvests, and the death of livestock, the blame was placed squarely on the bony shoulders of witches, because it was believed that God would never inflict such harm on his loyal followers. Witches were believed to be able to summon evil spirits and demons, but in reality, they were just usually poor, elderly women who owned a cat. Odd or different women were frequently ostracized and punished. In 1542, the Witchcraft Act was passed by Parliament and established that witchcraft was a crime punishable by death. Witch hunting became all the rage after that, especially in southeast England. It is believed that over 500 people were executed for witchcraft between the
We still do a lot of witch hunts in this country too. Just look at your political environment.
15th and 18th centuries. On the other hand, the hysteria over suspected witchcraft did eventually lead to the Vin Diesel masterpiece, The Last Witch Hunter. So, we'll call it a mixed bag. So what do you think? Which of these laws
that was
do you
really
think
interesting. I love that. I like history when it has to do with sorry about that. I like history when it has to do with things like that, old law and old, what we thought and how wrong people were back in the day. But don't let them fool you, because they were very smart. They knew that passing these crimes or trying to accuse you of a crime would lead to your death. That's exactly what they wanted. People were very petty then, as they are now. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye.